Right now, somewhere in the world, a number is going up. Not the price of gas, not the stock market, not your rent. A number so large, most people stop thinking about it the moment they hear it. National debt, trillions of dollars, growing every second, owed by governments, backed by promises, and quietly shaping the future of everyone alive today. Some people say national debt is a ticking time bomb. Others say it doesn't matter at all. So which is it? Is national debt a dangerous addiction, or simply how modern countries function? And here's the deeper question most people never ask. Who exactly is this money owed to? And what happens if it's never paid back? To answer that, we need to start at the beginning. Because before we can decide whether national debt is good or bad, we need to understand what it actually is. Please like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment the next video topic in the comments. National debt goes by many names. You might hear it called public debt, government debt, or sovereign debt. They all mean roughly the same thing. National debt is the total amount of money a government owes to others. That's it. No mystery, no conspiracy, no hidden math. It's simply the accumulation of past borrowing that hasn't been paid back yet. But that simple definition hides something important. Because unlike personal debt or business debt, national debt works by a completely different set of rules. Let's slow down and break it apart. When a government spends money, it has three basic options. It can collect taxes, it can print money, or it can borrow. Taxes are politically painful. Printing money can cause inflation. Borrowing often feels easier. So when spending exceeds revenue, governments borrow the difference. That borrowing becomes national debt. Think of it like a running tab. Every year a government compares how much it collected to how much it spent. If spending is higher, the gap gets added to the tab, and that tab never resets. It just grows or shrinks over time. Now here's where many people get confused. National debt is not the same as a country's deficit. A deficit is a yearly shortfall. Debt is the total accumulation of all past deficits. Deficit is a single year. Debt is the entire history. A country can reduce its deficit and still have rising debt. That alone surprises a lot of people. Another key misunderstanding. National debt is not one big loan. It's not owed to a single entity. It doesn't have one interest rate, and it doesn't have one due date. National debt is made up of thousands, sometimes millions, of individual obligations. Different lenders, different terms, different timelines. Some debts mature in weeks, others in decades, which raises a critical question. Who is actually lending all this money? We'll answer that later, and when we do, it may completely change how you see debt. But first, we need to understand what makes government debt unique. Unlike you, a government doesn't die. It doesn't retire. It doesn't stop existing. And in most cases, it doesn't fully pay off its debt. Instead, it rolls debt forward. Old debt gets paid using new borrowing. This sounds alarming at first, but it's normal. Governments don't aim to eliminate debt. They aim to manage it. That alone separates national debt from household debt. Another major difference. Most national debt is issued in the country's own currency. That means the government controls the money it uses to repay. This gives it power that individuals don't have. But it also introduces risks, especially inflation. We'll come back to that later. For now, just understand this. Debt isn't automatically dangerous. But uncontrolled debt, or mismanaged debt, can become dangerous. The problem isn't borrowing. The problem is what borrowing enables and what it delays. Let's talk scale. When people hear trillions, their brains shut down. So here's a better way to think about it. National debt is not about the absolute number. It's about size relative to the economy. A country with a strong, productive economy can carry more debt safely. A weaker economy cannot. This idea becomes central later when we talk about debt to GDP ratios, one of the most misunderstood metrics in economics. And yes, governments absolutely use it to justify massive borrowing. Whether they should is another question. Now here's something most people never hear. A country can have high national debt and still be financially stable. It can even grow faster because of that debt. That sounds backwards. But debt can fund infrastructure, education, research, defense, emergency response. Used well, debt builds future capacity. Used poorly, it creates stagnation. Debt itself is neutral. What matters is how it's used, and whether future generations are stronger or weaker because of it. At this point, you might be wondering something important. If national debt isn't inherently bad, why do politicians argue about it so aggressively? Why does it trigger panic headlines? Why do some countries collapse under debt, while others don't? To answer that, we need to understand why countries borrow in the first place. Because once you see the reasons, you'll realize debt is not a sign of failure. It's a design choice, and sometimes a trap. That's what we're unpacking next. In the next section, we're going to answer a deceptively simple question. If borrowing is risky, and taxing is unpopular, and printing money is dangerous, why do countries keep choosing debt anyway? And what happens when borrowing stops being a temporary tool and becomes a permanent dependency? That's next. At first glance, borrowing money seems like a strange habit for a government. After all, governments have power that ordinary people don't. They can tax. They can print money. They can pass laws. So why borrow at all? Why take on debt instead of just paying for things directly? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. Because borrowing solves problems right now while pushing costs into the future. And modern governments are built around managing the present. Let's start with the most basic reason countries borrow. Timing. Governments don't receive money evenly throughout the year. Taxes come in waves. Spending happens constantly. Borrowing smooths that gap. It allows governments to function without constant disruption. But that's only the surface-level reason. The deeper reasons go much further. Reason 1. Emergencies don't wait. Crises don't ask for permission. Wars, pandemics, financial collapses, natural disasters. When something breaks, governments must act immediately. There is no time to raise taxes first. There is no time to debate long-term funding. Borrowing allows instant response. And in moments like these, debt is often the least bad option. Raising taxes during a crisis can worsen the damage. Printing money can trigger inflation. Doing nothing can collapse the system entirely. Debt becomes the emergency lever. But here's the problem. Emergencies are supposed to be rare. In the modern world, they're constant. Reason 2. Building the future before it exists. Some things are too expensive to wait for. Highways, power grids, schools, hospitals, ports, water systems. If governments waited until they had full cash on hand, many of these projects would never happen. Debt allows countries to build now and pay later. The logic is straightforward. If a project increases productivity, future generations benefit and help repay the cost. This is one of the strongest arguments for national debt. Used correctly, debt isn't consumption. It's investment. But that used correctly part is doing a lot of work. Because not all borrowing builds the future. Some of it just maintains the present. Reason 3. Politics hates pain. This is where economics collides with reality. Raising taxes is unpopular. Cutting spending is unpopular. Borrowing is quieter. Debt doesn't trigger immediate outrage. It doesn't show up as a higher bill tomorrow. The consequences are delayed, often beyond the next election. So debt becomes the politically easiest option, not because it's best, but because it hurts the least right now. Over time, this creates a pattern. Spending promises are made. Borrowing fills the gap. Debt accumulates quietly, and no single decision feels catastrophic. Until suddenly, the total does. Reason 4. Economic stimulation. Sometimes governments borrow on purpose, even when they don't have to. Why? Because slowing economies are dangerous. When people stop spending, businesses fail. When businesses fail, unemployment rises. When unemployment rises, tax revenue falls. This creates a downward spiral. Borrowing allows governments to inject money into the economy. Stimulus spending, public works, social support. The goal is to prevent collapse. And often it works. But there's a trade-off. Stimulus debt assumes future growth will be strong enough to absorb it. If growth doesn't come, the debt doesn't disappear. Reason 5. Currency control. Countries that borrow in their own currency have a unique advantage. They don't face the same constraints as households. They can always create the currency needed to repay. This gives them flexibility and temptation. Because if debt becomes uncomfortable, they can inflate it away. But inflation is not free. It quietly transfers wealth. It distorts prices. It erodes trust. Debt backed by currency power is manageable, but fragile. And once confidence cracks, things unravel fast. We'll explore that later. The hidden reason: debt buys time. This is the reason rarely spoken aloud. Debt delays hard choices. It postpones reforms. It masks structural problems. It smooths over inefficiencies. Borrowing allows systems to continue functioning, even when they're unsustainable. For a while, this is why debt grows during good times and bad times. During recessions, it's used to stabilize. During growth, it's used to avoid restraint. Over decades, debt stops being a temporary tool and becomes permanent infrastructure. At this point, a critical question emerges. If countries borrow so much, who keeps giving them money? Why do lenders trust governments with trillions of dollars? Why doesn't the entire system collapse under its own weight? To answer that, we need to follow the money. Because national debt only exists if someone is willing to hold it. And once you see who those lenders are, you'll realize national debt is not just an economic issue. It's a global network of incentives, power, and risk. In the next section, we're going to uncover who actually lends money to governments, why bonds are considered safe until they aren't, how institutions like the IMF and World Bank really operate, and what happens when lenders start to lose confidence. Because national debt doesn't exist in isolation. It exists because someone believes they'll get paid. What happens when that belief changes? That's next. If countries are constantly borrowing money, the next obvious question is this: who is lending it? Because governments don't borrow from a single place. They borrow from a massive, layered system made up of investors, institutions, and other governments, all connected by one key idea: trust. As long as lenders believe they'll be paid back, the system works. Once that trust weakens, everything changes. Let's start with the foundation of national debt. Most government borrowing happens through something called bonds. A bond is simple. The government says, lend us money today, and we'll pay you back later, with interest. That's it. No ownership, no control, just a promise. Bonds come in different lengths: short-term, medium-term, long-term. Some mature in months. Some take decades. And trillions of dollars flow through this system every year. But here's what makes bonds special. They're not just loans. They're tradable assets. Almost everyone: pension funds, insurance companies, banks, investment firms, foreign governments, central banks, even individual investors. If you have a retirement account, there's a good chance you indirectly own government debt. Why? Because government bonds are considered among the safest investments in the world. Not because governments never fail, but because failure is rare and catastrophic when it happens. So the system bends over backward to prevent it. Governments have advantages that no other borrower has. They can tax. They can regulate. They can control currency. They can outlast almost any institution. Most governments don't disappear overnight, and that makes their promises unusually durable. As long as the economy exists, the debt exists. That stability makes bonds attractive, especially during uncertainty. When markets panic, money often flows into government debt, not away from it. This is one of the strangest features of the system. Fear strengthens the borrower. But bonds aren't the whole picture. There's another layer, one that steps in when countries are already in trouble. The International Monetary Fund exists for one reason: to lend to countries that can't borrow normally anymore. When investors stop buying a country's bonds, when interest rates spike, when confidence collapses, the IMF steps in. But IMF loans are different. They come with conditions: spending cuts, tax changes, structural reforms, policy oversight. The IMF doesn't just lend money. It reshapes economies. This is where debt stops being neutral and starts becoming political. From one angle, the IMF prevents collapse. It stabilizes currencies, restores confidence, keeps governments functioning. From another angle, it limits sovereignty. Countries receiving IMF loans often lose control over key decisions: budgets, social programs, labor markets. The logic is simple. If we're lending you money, we want to make sure you change the system that caused the problem. Whether that helps or harms depends on who you ask. But one thing is clear. Once a country relies on IMF support, it's no longer borrowing freely. It's borrowing under supervision. The World Bank operates differently. Its focus is long-term development, infrastructure, education, health systems, poverty reduction. The loans are slower, cheaper, more targeted, but they still create debt. And like IMF loans, they often come with expectations: reforms, oversight, project accountability. These institutions don't just move money. They shape national priorities. Countries also lend directly to other countries. sometimes for profit, sometimes for influence, sometimes for stability. This is where debt becomes geopolitics. When one country holds large amounts of another country's debt, power dynamics shift. Debt can create leverage. It can also create dependency. And sometimes it creates tension. But here's the twist. The largest lenders are often the most exposed. If the borrower collapses, the lender loses too. Debt ties countries together, whether they want it or not. Now we reach the most misunderstood players. Central banks. Central banks buy government bonds, sometimes in massive quantities. Why? To control interest rates, to stabilize markets, to inject money into the system. When a central bank buys government debt, it's effectively lending to its own government. This blurs the line between borrower and lender, and it changes the rules. Because central banks don't need profit, they need stability. This is where national debt starts behaving differently than normal loans. Everything depends on belief. Belief that debt will be repaid. Belief that currency will hold value. Belief that institutions will survive. When that belief weakens, lenders demand higher interest. Higher interest increases costs. Higher costs increase risk. Risk scares lenders. This feedback loop is how debt crises begin. Not suddenly, gradually, quietly, until the math stops working. Here's the strange truth. National debt exists because it's trusted, and it collapses when it stops being trusted. It's both incredibly stable and extremely fragile. As long as lenders believe repayment is inevitable, debt can grow almost endlessly. But once doubt enters the system, the same debt becomes dangerous. So now we arrive at the question most people really care about. Is national debt actually bad? Or is it just misunderstood? Because if everyone is borrowing, and everyone is lending, and the system keeps functioning, at what point does debt become a problem? That's where we're going next. In the next section, we'll explore whether national debt is actually harmful, what the debt-to-GDP ratio really measures, why some countries carry massive debt without collapsing, and what happens when limits like debt ceilings appear. Because the size of the debt matters less than how it fits into the economy. And once you understand that relationship, you'll see national debt very differently. By now, national debt probably feels less mysterious. Countries borrow, lenders lend. The system runs on trust. So here's the question people argue about the most. Is national debt actually bad? Or is it just misunderstood? Because some countries are buried in debt and still function. Others collapse with far less. So the danger clearly isn't just the number itself. It's something deeper. This is where confusion begins. People compare government debt to personal debt. But governments don't work like households. A household has a limited lifespan, a limited income, no ability to print money, no control over the economy. A government is different. It doesn't retire. It doesn't die. It doesn't need to pay off debt the way a person does. Most government debt is rolled over, not eliminated. Old debt is paid with new debt. And that's not a failure of the system. That is the system. Debt can be productive. Borrowing to build roads, ports, power grids, education systems, these things can grow the economy. If the economy grows faster than the debt becomes easier to manage over time. This is why fast-growing countries can carry large debts without trouble. The key isn't debt size. It's debt relative to economic output, which brings us to the most important metric. Debt to GDP compares what a country owes to what it produces in a year. Think of it like this. If a country earns $1 trillion per year and owes $1 trillion, its debt to GDP ratio is 100%. That doesn't mean collapse. It means the country owes about 1 year's worth of output. Some stable countries operate above 100% for decades. Others struggle at 60%. Why? Because context matters. 3 things matter more than the raw number. First, economic growth. If GDP grows faster than debt, the ratio stabilizes or falls. Second, interest rates. Low interest means debt is cheap to service. Third, currency control. Countries that borrow in their own currency have more flexibility. If a government controls its currency, it can always create more of it. That doesn't mean it should, but it can. This is why debt is less dangerous for some countries than others. Debt becomes dangerous when confidence breaks. If lenders worry about repayment, interest rates rise. Higher interest increases debt costs. Higher costs squeeze budgets. Budgets cut slow growth. Slower growth worsens debt. This is how debt spirals form. Not overnight. Step by step. And once interest consumes too much of the budget, the government loses room to act. Some countries impose legal limits on how much they can borrow. This is called a debt ceiling. It doesn't limit spending directly. It limits borrowing authority. This creates a strange situation. A government may already be obligated to spend money, but legally blocked from borrowing to pay for it. That doesn't control debt. It creates political risk. Markets don't worry about debt ceilings because of money. They worry because of uncertainty. When trust wobbles, costs rise. Even if default never happens. Yes, countries can default, but it's rarely sudden. It usually follows years of slow pressure. Rising interest, falling growth, currency stress, capital flight. Default damages trust, raises future borrowing costs, shrinks investment. That's why governments avoid it at almost any cost. Debt can be managed. Loss of trust is harder to fix. People often ask, why don't countries just pay off their debt? Because the system isn't designed for zero debt. Eliminating debt would drain money from the economy, reduce liquidity, disrupt financial markets, shrink investment options. Debt is embedded in modern finance. The question isn't how to erase it. It's how to keep it stable. National debt is not good or bad by default. It's a tool. Used well, it supports growth. Used poorly, it magnifies weakness. The danger isn't borrowing. The danger is borrowing without growth, trust, or control. But this raises one final question. If debt is normal, if debt can even be useful, could a country exist without it at all? Or is national debt unavoidable? That's where we're going next. In the next section, we'll explore whether a country can truly be debt-free, why a few places have almost no national debt, what trade-offs come with zero borrowing, and whether debt-free nations are more stable or more fragile, because sometimes avoiding debt creates problems of its own. By now, we've seen that national debt isn't automatically dangerous. It can support growth. It can stabilize economies. It can even be essential. So here's the question that naturally follows. Can a country exist without national debt at all? And if it can, is that actually a good thing? At first glance, being debt-free sounds ideal. No interest payments. No bond markets to satisfy. No lenders to worry about. No risk of default. It sounds clean, responsible, safe. So why don't more countries do it? Because debt-free countries are rare. And when they exist, they're usually very unusual cases. A small number of places operate with extremely low national debt. These are usually very small economies, territories with special legal status, places with unique revenue sources. They don't represent the average country, and their situation is often misunderstood. There are only a few ways for a country to avoid borrowing. 1. High, reliable government revenue. This usually comes from a narrow source: tourism, trade hubs, or natural resources. 2. Limited government spending. Small populations mean fewer services to fund. 3. External support or special arrangements. Some territories don't carry full national responsibilities. Debt-free status usually isn't the result of discipline alone. It's the result of structure. Avoiding debt sounds responsible, but debt also provides flexibility. When governments refuse to borrow, they lose tools. They can't stimulate the economy during recessions, respond quickly to crises, fund large infrastructure projects up front. Without debt, governments must raise taxes or cut spending immediately. That creates instability of a different kind. Debt-free countries are often cited as proof that borrowing is unnecessary. But their conditions don't scale. A country with millions of citizens, complex economies, large militaries, global responsibilities, cannot operate like a city-state or territory. Debt isn't a moral failure. It's an economic mechanism. Counterintuitively, issuing debt can signal strength. Investors only lend to governments they trust. A country with no debt may simply not need to borrow, or may not have access to credit at scale. The presence of debt often reflects market confidence, not recklessness. The real question is, can debt remain sustainable? Sustainability depends on economic growth, stable institutions, currency control, political credibility. Countries don't collapse because they borrow. They collapse when borrowing loses credibility. If all governments stopped borrowing, bond markets would shrink, pensions would lose safe assets, banks would lose collateral, global finance would destabilize. Debt connects governments to financial systems. Removing it entirely would break more than it fixes. In modern economies, debt is not an exception. It's a feature. Governments borrow. Businesses borrow. Households borrow. The system runs on promises about the future. The question isn't whether debt exists. It's whether the future can support it. So, can a country be debt-free? Yes, technically. But for most countries, it would be unnecessary, restrictive, economically limiting. Debt-free status is not a goal. Stability is. So now we've come full circle. We know what national debt is, why countries borrow, who lends to them, when debt becomes dangerous, and why zero debt isn't the ideal it sounds like. Which leaves one final question. If debt isn't evil, and zero debt isn't realistic, what should we actually worry about? In the conclusion, we'll answer. What truly makes national debt dangerous? Why fear-based debt narratives miss the point? What signals matter more than the debt number? And the one question every citizen should ask about their country's future. Because national debt isn't really about money. It's about trust. So after everything we've covered, let's strip this down to its core. National debt is not a monster. It's not a ticking time bomb by default. And it's not proof that a country is failing. National debt is a tool. And like any tool, it depends on how it's used. It is not like personal debt. A government does not run out of money the way a household does. It does not face a final payday where everything must be paid back at once. It does not operate on a single lifetime. Countries exist across generations. Their debt is rolled over, refinanced, adjusted, and managed continuously. When people say, the government is bankrupt, what they usually mean is, I don't understand how sovereign finance works. A big number looks scary, but the size of the debt alone tells us almost nothing. What matters is, can the economy grow? Can the government collect revenue? Do people trust the system? Does the country control its currency? Are investors willing to keep lending? Debt becomes dangerous only when trust breaks, not when numbers get large. Debt crises don't start because debt exists. They start when growth collapses, political systems freeze, corruption destroys confidence, currencies weaken, or institutions lose credibility. At that point, lenders stop believing in the future. And debt is, at its core, a belief in the future. When a government borrows, it's making a statement. We believe the future will be productive enough to support this. That belief can be right or wrong, but debt itself is not the problem. Broken futures are. A debt-free country isn't automatically healthy. It may be underinvesting, avoiding growth, lacking financial depth, or structurally limited. Modern economies need flexibility. Debt provides that flexibility. The goal isn't zero debt. The goal is resilience. So here's the question that actually matters. Is this debt building a stronger future, or just delaying hard choices? Debt used to build infrastructure, educate workers, stabilize recessions, support innovation, can strengthen a country for decades. Debt used to cover inefficiency, delay reform, support broken systems, eventually becomes a burden. Same tool, different outcome. You don't need to panic every time you hear a debt headline, but you should pay attention to economic growth, institutional stability, political incentives, long-term planning. Those matter far more than the raw number. National debt isn't about money alone. It's about whether a society is investing in its future or borrowing from it. Debt does not decide a country's fate. Trust does. Growth does. Institutions do. A nation collapses not when it borrows, but when it stops believing in tomorrow. So the next time you hear a terrifying debt number, ask yourself, is this debt building a future worth paying for? Because that answer matters more than the number ever will. Don't forget to subscribe on your way out. See you next video.